Welcome to One Work, Five Questions with Donna Vitek and Dr. Mark Andrew Holotech. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Holotech.
Thank you for having me. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing just fine, thank you.
I'm 54. I'm a year older today.
Oh my goodness. Getting
Yeah.
up there. I'm going to have a birthday. Happy birthday. I'm going to have a
Thank
birthday
you.
coming up too. I won't even tell you how old I'm going to be.
Oh, I know. The dinosaurs were roaming the earth back then.
That's it.
Well, today's episode is on Thomas Jefferson letter to George Washington, dated September 9th, 1792. So a little bit more of George Washington is in our day today. So I'm excited because if you hang on, everybody, because we have a special guest joining us today at the end of the show. So I'm not going to say any more. But we shall examine a very lengthy letter that Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson wrote to President George Washington to voice his disagreements about Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton. So even since the beginning, we had trouble within the government, people agreeing on things. So, well, I am Donna Vitek, and this is One Work, Five Questions. Are you ready for question one, Dr. Holotech?
I'm ready. Let's rock.
Okay. Question number one. Jefferson begins his letter with the mention of internal dissensions. Can you elaborate or summarize with whom are the internal dissensions and why?
Well, that's an easy one. Washington writes a lengthy letter to Jefferson on August 23 of the same year.
Okay.
He writes a letter to Hamilton at the same time. He's aware of the squabbling that's going on, that's got into the partisan newspapers, about which I shall talk shortly.
Okay.
Hamilton is writing in Fenno's Gazette of the United States, Jefferson, Fenno's National Gazette. Hamilton is assuming a pseudonym for all of the essays that he's publishing pretty much against Jeffersonian style government, and Jefferson is writing through Hamilton. So Washington is irate because we've got this political bickering going on in his own cabinet. And I won't get into the gist, but you talk about this internal dissensions, and Jefferson mentions that in his letter. He says that such dissensions have taken place is certain, and even among those who are nearest to you in administration. And Jefferson says they bother me more than anybody else, right? Yet he says, yet I'm so desirous ever that you should know the whole truth and believe no more than the truth, that I am glad to seize every occasion for developing to you whatever I do or think relative to the government, and shall therefore ask permission to be more lengthy now than the occasion particularly calls for, or could otherwise perhaps justify. The could, perhaps, Thomas, could and perhaps don't need to be in the same sentence. Sorry, Thomas, grammatical gaffe on your part. He says in the next paragraph, when I embarked in the government, it was with a determination to intermeddle not at all with the legislature and as little possible with my departments. Now, it's a fairly interesting comment. Basically, he's, Jefferson is Secretary of State, Hamilton is Secretary of Treasury, and Jefferson is in some sense saying Hamilton should attend to fiscal affairs, and I, Thomas, will attend to affairs of state, right, as is my station. Now, that needs to be taken cum grano salis, with a grain of salt, because there were, in the departments, there were no specifically designated duties that the Secretary of Treasury has to do this, Secretary of War has to do this. But as the title indicates, you'd think Hamilton would be focusing on fiscal affairs. And so Jefferson is accusing Hamilton of intermeddling, and in a matter of sense, he's entirely right. So these internal dissensions are dissensions that Jefferson acknowledges are acutely in existence, acutely extant between himself and Alexander Hamilton.
Wow. And back then, the government positions weren't determined by partisan, right? There was right. So you had so anybody today who thinks that the president, there should be I've heard people say there should be a vice president that's one political party and a different political party for the president, and that doesn't work. We saw that's how it started. And it didn't work. Okay, question number 2. It's so much, we can learn so much from history. Question number 2, Jefferson mentions not wanting to intermeddle with legislature or co-departments. Why is that? Why would he not want to work with his own lawmaking body?
Well, this goes back to the answer I gave already in the first question, is that, look, if Secretary of Treasurer should stay with items related to monetary issues, and Secretary of State related issues with respect to foreign policy and things like that, where he'd be able to help the president in that. Yeah, and I read that, right? So I guess I anticipated he doesn't want to intermeddle here. I'm going to read a quote I have here from Jefferson. It says, while our government was still in its most infant state, it enabled Hamilton so to strengthen himself by corrupt services to many that he could afterwards carry his blank scheme and every measure he proposed in defiance of all opposition. In fact, it was a principal ground whereon he reared up that speculating phalanx in and out of Congress, which he has since been able to give laws to change the political complexion of the government of the U.S. In effect, what Jefferson is accusing Hamilton, and I think rightly so, to be honest, is that Hamilton has a scheme for how government should be operating, and he's doing his damnedest to make sure Washington, as president, implements that scheme. Now, that said, Washington, and this will anticipate maybe David's questions later, Washington was his own person, and Washington was not partisan. Washington looked on issues as they came to him. Okay. So, yeah, I hope that answers the question. I think Jefferson just thinks people should, Secretary of Treasury should focus on things related to Treasury and money-making issues and give advice to the president. And, Secretary of War, insofar as matters of war, right, issues that pertain to matters of war and so on.
Yeah, I can see why that would be important for everybody to just stay in their lane. Question number 3, what was the problem Jefferson had with Hamilton's translation of general welfare from the U.S. Constitution, which is still a problem today, I think, between our Democrats and Republicans. They still have not agreed on had a consensus for the definition of general welfare. So what was the problem?
Well, this question gets at the gist of the feud, and I have argued in numerous publications Thomas Jefferson's Political Philosophy and the Metaphysics of Utopia. Should have had a copy of the book ready, but I don't have it right now. But the difference was a difference of philosophical vision for Jefferson, and for Hamilton, it was a difference of political vision. Hamilton thought that the difference is Hamilton wanted a assumption of state debts that we'll talk about in a bit. He wanted a strong bank. He wanted a strong president, presumably that could be elected for life, right, without any set terms and so forth. In effect, it was the British model, the monarchy. If a president's elected for life, he's no different from a king. And if he has powers that could not be enumerated, when I say can't be enumerated, it means they can't be fixed by a constitution. So Hamilton wanted a rather willowy interpretation of the Constitution. Jefferson wanted a very strict interpretation. If the Constitution says nothing about certain actions of a president, for example, you can't assume that it gives you carte blanche to do whatever it doesn't say.
Right.
So unless it specifically says something, it's saying you can't do that. That's the way Jefferson interprets it. Now we're going to, we'll obviously see there are times when that interpretation runs into, like the Louisiana Purchase, when it runs into problems. Mm-hmm. He says of Hamilton's financial system in his Annus, his remarks, a large part remarks against Hamilton. He says it was intended, I quote, as a puzzle to exclude popular understanding and inquiry, 2, as a machine for corruption of the legislature. Now, these are very, very strong claims that Jefferson's making against Hamilton. And strong notwithstanding, I think they're accurate claims. Mm-hmm. Hamilton was a highly ambitious person. He makes that clear in his early letters when he's talking about, and he makes it clear as well in several writings. I did a video prior to this on Hamilton, And there's a quote where Hamilton writes in a letter, he said, when there are opportunities for making money on money, a wise person is going to jump at that. Who gives a damn about making money for things that are useful, like farming or selling useful items? If I can go out and make money on someone else's folly, right, without having to do anything, without anything really getting done that's useful, then jump at that. That's what a wise person. Now we're going to talk. So Jefferson is in effect saying, and I think this is right on the money, that Hamilton, if you look at Hamilton in his life, general welfare meant the welfare of the smart people who are smart enough to make money off the scheme of things. In effect, Jefferson's accusing Hamilton of interpreting general welfare as being Hamilton's own well-being.
His general welfare. Okay.
Yeah, basically Hamilton saying, the president should be able to do whatever he wants to do, and Hamilton would take liberties. We'll talk about. Do I have anything to say about assumption? I don't know if I should talk about this. One of the issues here, and I'll deviate a little bit.
Not too much. We have a special guest coming.
Yeah, it's fine, but I mean, this is important to understand the difference.
Okay.
Jefferson comes back from France, and he's disturbed by all this talk of federalism going on. This very same thing that they tried to get away from with the Revolution. Right. And Hamilton tries to pass a bill for assumption of states' debts. In other words, there were all these unpaid debts to people who had bonds in the American Revolutionary War. So people invested in the war, got paid nothing for that. So Hamilton says, we have to pay these debts off. So he says, I've got this brilliant idea. We'll have the federal government, issue bonds so people can buy up these early debt cards. And in effect, what happens is he was enabling wealthy Northerners to buy up these debt cards at a pittance, and then the wealthy people who bought them from the people who were owed money can turn them into the government at full value. So I can buy something for $20 for maybe 20 cents, turning it into give the person who owned it 20 cents, turn it into the federal government, and get the $20 back. So this is what I meant by schemes, Hamiltonian schemes. So Hamilton was for this. Jefferson was sort of unaware of what was going on with assumption when he agreed to it. The idea was, Hamilton says, this didn't pass. So he urges Jefferson to help him let it pass. He says, in return for assumption, I will push that the new government be on the Potomac River, where it is, which would be close to the southern states. Jefferson's thinking, 120 miles from Monticello, pretty cool. So they make this exchange, and in some measure, Jefferson later on is pissed because he realized it was a scheme. It was a setup. Hamilton was trying to buy what he wanted. He wanted the government to invest in these debts. So the government would assume a heavy debt, With the government assuming much debt, the government becomes strong, It owes the several states. So there's this intimate relationship between the government and the states. And we're on our way to having a Bank of the United States, to having a strong central federal government. So the economic policy was dictated to getting his political policies put in place. Strong president, Bank of the United States, heavy federal debt. Instead of the debts being spread across the states, let the federal government assume that makes the federal government strong. Jefferson got really pissed at all that because of these political machinations. That was that issue here. Does that help solve some matters here?
Yes, it does, because when I was reading the letter, I felt like I could feel his tension and his need to explain, and now this makes sense. I'm glad.
Hamilton's dupery. Hamilton had several things in the back. Hamilton was, from what I know of Hamilton, whenever he had political schemes, he was never averse to personally profiting by those schemes. Jefferson always thought that was just wicked and wrong. Thank goodness for Jefferson, That's we don't see politicians like that today, do we?
No, we don't. No. Question number 4. Was this the beginning of political upheaval between the political parties?
Absolutely. It's a pertinent question, and people always argue that Jefferson and Hamilton were responsible for the bipartisan bickering that we have today. This is true. But, and we'll see that next week, Jefferson never saw this as political bickering. He always thought it as philosophical bickering.
Oh.
Because Jefferson didn't have, in effect, a political, he had a philosophical vision.
Right.
Why do we want liberty? Why do we want a weak central government and strong state governments? We want liberalist people free to do it, because he had a vision for what it meant for people to be happy. Jefferson thought, look, I, Holowchak, am not entitled to tell you, birthday girl, how to live your life, what makes you happy. You can determine that for yourself. That's the strength of Jefferson republicanism. Each person can decide for himself how to live his life, and the government needs to stay out. Hamilton really thought people were too stupid to decide their own affairs. So he wasn't averse to saying, like Adams as well, like Putin today in Russia, the people are too stupid to know what's in their good. I will tell them what they're
I don't
doing.
know. I may agree with Hamilton today.
Well, it may be, I've said that too. Hamilton and Adams might be right, but if they are, it's sort of a sad thing.
It is that people,
it would
the
be
strength.
a very, very sad thing. But on the other hand, look, the one thing we know, that even if Hamilton and Adams are right, that people are too dull to figure out what's in their own best interest in everything. It's much worse when you've got a small group of people or one person telling you what's in your best interest. Then the situation is really bad. It's better for the individuals to fumble through that and make numerous mistakes in thinking than it is for other people to tell you how to live.
I totally agree with you. That is the right way.
You agree with me on something.
For once.
Wow, for once.
Are we're kind of like Jefferson and Adams, aren't we?
Yeah, and before we get to the final question, I'll tell you a quick story. So we're getting back to the psychological differences between the two. And this is a really cute story. Jefferson with Hamilton and others were dining while Jefferson was in Europe, when Jefferson was back. And there are 3 pictures on the wall, Jefferson's heroes, Bacon, Locke, and Newton. And Hamilton looks around and he looks, who are they? Now, to me, that is astonishing. It'd be like someone, imagine you had a picture of Einstein on your wall and I dining at your place, I'd say, who's that? And what would you think? How do you not know what John Locke looks like, or Isaac Newton, greatest minds in the history of the world? You do not know who Newton is.
I would think those are attendance certificates behind you.
Yeah. Anyways, but Jefferson was sort of nonplussed and says, how do you not know who they are? He goes, those are the 3 greatest people who have ever lived. And he explains, right, Locke, Bacon, and Newton. And Hamilton pauses for a while and he says, the greatest man who ever lived is Julius Caesar.
Oh.
And that blew away. Some people say that Hamilton was joking and pulling Jefferson's leg, which would have been easy enough to do, Jefferson always being serious.
Yeah.
I don't think so. Hamilton was highly ambitious, and I think that for him to have Julius Caesar as a hero was quite opposite, quite appropriate. Jefferson sort of walks away and thinks, well, that tells you everything you need to know about Hamilton.
Right.
Where my heroes are scientists and philosophers, his hero is a military autocrat. Cool story.
Well, yeah, I guess you need a little bit of both, huh? But okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have a special guest joining us. I think I did it correctly. Okay, I did. David Ginsburg. He's we need your camera. Do you have a camera, David?
Oh, there we go.
There we go. Okay.
He's got the microphone, a map, and everything. I feel kind of bad, but
I know. I don't even know where mine went. Oh, it's over here. So I'd like to welcome David Ginsburg to our show today. He is a former classmate, and we are now graduates with our master's, both having a master's degree in history education. And he has been chomping at the bit to speak with you and ask question number 5. So David's question is, how did Jefferson disagree with Washington regarding economics, foreign policy, and military? And there's 2 parts to the question. Do you want to just answer that first, or would you like for me to
ask both? Because I think they could both be answered at the same time.
Okay. Okay, and then how did those differences influence Jefferson's approach to these issues during his own presidency?
For one, I don't think you can say that George Washington had set views. He did not have, to the best of my knowledge, a set philosophy for what the nature of the human beast was, as did Hamilton, as did Adams, for example. Adams thought much about the nature, and he published in his books, didn't think much about human beings. He thought they were greedy and self-centered. So did Hamilton. Washington, to the best of my knowledge, doesn't have a set view of human nature. It never fleshes it out anywhere. So I don't think it's fair to say that Washington had set policies. He didn't. Washington was a very eclectic president. And to his, to give him a pat on the back, I would say that Washington gleaned information wherever he could. He had a very, very capable cabinet, right? We talked of that already, who was in his cabinet, some very, very important people. And he gleaned information from all people whenever he had important decisions to make. So I don't think he had an agenda. A lot of people would argue, Thomas Fleming would argue that, Washington was the more important figure, and Washington had leanings towards Hamilton with respect to the bank and other things and a strong government. He sided with Washington. I don't think he had any leanings towards Hamilton. Gordon Wood, famous celebrated historian, said that if you examine the decisions that Washington made, he sided with Jefferson as often as he sided with Hamilton. It may be that some of the larger issues he decided in a Hamiltonian direction. I don't think that it's right to say that Washington had any particular leanings in one way or another that would indicate a sort of partisanship, a sort of political philosophy, or sort of political vision. And Jefferson said on several occasions in some of his writings that Washington was always sort of skeptical about implementation of Jefferson's vision of what a healthy republic should be, right? Citizens free to do whatever they want to do, to elect and recall representatives, to dictate their own affairs, to have a weak. He says he always was willing to give, and he says that I'm willing to give the experiment a fair try. But he was, I think, later in life doubtful. I think he thought in a Hamiltonian direction just because his views became skeptical in terms of whether or not what Jefferson was saying could be implemented. And perhaps Washington was right. And the other one was, let's see, you said, how did the differences influence? So I don't think there were any policies of Washington, because Washington had necessarily any sort of political leaning, even though he tended to go in a Hamiltonian direction later in life. But I would say that the fight that Jefferson, the ongoing feud that he had with Hamilton, shaped his views, honed his views, which were in place already, right? By the time he got back from France, he knew what government should be like. He had a view of people, but he also, but by the time he gets back, his feud with Hamilton informs the two political parties. So Jefferson's philosophical views become the basis for a political platform, whether Jefferson liked it or not. And we'll talk more about that later. So I think, his own views, he had strict interpretation of the Constitution when he becomes president. Government not meddling in the affairs of people. Jefferson always said, the president or even any sort of governor should be like a machine, right? They're inputs and outputs. You put some input in the machine, it gives you an output, but that's all. So in other words, the best form of government is one that is not seen, that is just a reflection of the will of the people. That Jefferson always thought. Now, did he always behave that way? Not always, but he tried to. I think he really tried to. So I think we can argue that the differences between Jefferson and Hamilton are evident in Jefferson's presidency, though we can say many of Hamilton's policies Jefferson did not reverse when he became like strong. The government was fairly central and strong at the time, and Jefferson really didn't put on the brakes and try to reverse all that. So
I wonder, David, do you have anything you'd like to add, Dr. Holowchak?
First off, thank you both for having me.
where do you get the cool headset there?
Well,
I need one of those things. Cover it.
I got this very nice headset for only $5 at Five Below, and I wear these all the time, even when I'm not on a live Zoom call, because they're semi noise canceling, and I find that very helpful if I'm in this room to study, or if I'm lesson planning for work, or even when I am on a Zoom call. It's nice to be able to have my attention on the Zoom call itself, and these are really comfortable.
You must do a lot of Zooming.
I do, yes.
Well, did you have anything to add? Did you have any disagreement with what I said about Jefferson and Washington? She said you're a fan of Washington, and I might ask, what do you like about Washington? I'm a fan of Washington too. One of the things I like is that his eclecticism, in the sense that he didn't have any biases, and that he was not afraid. He was not well educated, but he's highly intelligent. He was not afraid to surround himself with extraordinarily high men of high intelligence to give him information. I think that's pretty cool. I do the same thing.
Yeah. I don't know if I can really call him relatable. I mean, he is a big figure in our history. And granted that he existed well before my time, we would obviously have our differences by modern standards. But I was always really interested by the American Revolution in school. And I had this one high school history teacher who only touched on it for a week or two. And I remember asking him, well, can we learn more about it? And he said, oh, do it on your own time. So fast forward almost a decade later.
Well, there is, I can recommend, I've published, there's a online journal called Journal of the American Revolution. Are you familiar with that?
I think I've read bits and pieces of it. I'd be very interested in learning
Just
more.
look it up, type in journal. I get their notices all the time. And once in a while, when I have ambition, I might, this piece I did on Alexander Hamilton, I might. So if you're interested in the revolution, they tend to focus on events narrowly related to the revolution. And it's pretty good journal. It's very, very readable. So I highly recommend that.
Thank you. I'll look into that. So fast forward about 10 years later, I was Donna's classmate in our final course together in our GCU graduate program. And I had to pick a subject for my final topic. I believe, Donna, what do we call that? We called it the senior thesis, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So I chose George Washington, and I wanted to look at his influence on modern America. And our instructor rejected that. She said, that's not specific enough. I want you to make an actual argument of the past. So I said, well, what if I called him America's first king? And she said, okay, go ahead. So I did my research, and I
Well,
found.
I would agree with you there. And the first thing you said is just too vague and too general. And if you say something like the first king, the first thing that perks up, like, what the why was he a king? And it's a very interesting, very controversial, interesting thesis. But go ahead.
Let me elaborate on that. So Washington, like you said, he was not well educated by means of he didn't have advanced schooling. He was very conscientious about that. In order to prove my argument that he was a king, I had to look at how others perceived him. And the more I learned about others' perceptions of Washington, the more I learned about his innermost thoughts of himself. Washington was extremely conscientious of his public image, even in his time as commander in chief. Based on my reading of some of his journal entries, I'd say he might have even struggled with anxiety. He might have had generalized anxiety disorder. He wrote a private letter to his wife, Martha, and he was saying, I do not want to be this commander in chief. And he expressed so much distaste for it. At the same time, you could say to those around him, he came across as arrogant, greedy. He wanted the power, he craved it. He physically tortured his own men for even the slightest of insubordination, even resorting to public execution to prove his point. But fast forward to his presidency, he had the attitude of anything I do is going to set the stage for any future president. So he became extremely conscientious. Like every little thing he did, even walking outside. One of his greatest fears was that the American people would see him as a god. So every day at noon, he would walk across the courtyard and walk through the streets, which back then there was no Secret Service. So he'd walk through the streets of the common people every day at noon to show them, I'm just like you. But Hamilton was a protege to Washington. And like you were saying, Dr. Holowchak, there was a huge feud between Jefferson and Hamilton. And I would say Jefferson was pro Washington, but Jefferson was not pro Hamilton. And Washington leans a lot on Hamilton. Because Washington himself, he acknowledged he couldn't do it alone. He relied on his most trusted of advisors to say, okay, how should a president act? And probably what Hamilton's most controversial idea was the whiskey tax. And the way that a lot of the American people perceived the whiskey tax was, we just traded King George III of England to King George I of America. And then James Madison started publishing newspaper articles from what is now called the National Gazette, personally attacking him. And I know Jefferson was not the author of the articles, but Jefferson was giving him ideas. And one of the articles specifically on Washington's birthday compared Washington as the American president to Julius Caesar as the Roman emperor.
Yeah, we saw a little bit of that last time when we talked about the last episode we did when we talked about the Sampsons and Solomons and stuff. And Jefferson was alluding to Washington there. I like what you said about Washington's high level of anxiety as president, and it's only natural that he should have high anxiety because because he was surrounded, he wasn't as intelligent as the people around him, and certainly that's he was a good general, capable general, and but put him as a president, as an intellectual figure, had to be a very, very anxiety-producing milieu for him. So certainly there's no question that he felt inadequate to the job at times, and he had high levels of anxiety, but I don't think that I would blame him. And the other thing is, too, a point you made, this very, very good point, is that he realized that every decision he made, every step he took was setting a precedent for future presidents, for how future leaders should act, right? And Adams follows the sort of pomp in the Washington presidency, and Jefferson, when he's elected, breaks it, right? When his inauguration, day of his inauguration, he walks in the street, he's simply dressed, he has a simple speech. And yeah, everything that Washington was certainly aware that everything he did was going to set a precedent for future presidents. So he was walking on eggshells. It had to be an anxiety-producing environment for him.
Absolutely. And it's almost tragic that his presidency absolutely ruined his public reputation. At one point, there were riots in Pennsylvania, and Washington donned a military uniform, and he led militiamen to defuse the riots. In reality, he was enforcing the law, but the way it made him look was he's using military force, just like King George did. And Jefferson and Jefferson and Madison knew how to play that. It didn't matter what the reality was. They knew how to sway readers with the National Gazette. And they used that to just demolish Washington's public image.
Yeah, that something I didn't say today or even last week, but that is, through the publications, through Madison and other people writing in newspapers with Jefferson's support, Jefferson is substantially worried during the time of Washington's presidency of a Hamiltonian direction, of a push of the American government back to the sort of monarchism of England. And he does see that happening in Washington's cabinet. So there's no question that he's implicating Washington as well as high Federalists like Hamilton and so forth. But Jefferson does see Washington going in a Hamiltonian direction. That needs to be clear. And whether or not, my view is that Washington is going in that direction on certain important economic issues, but not. Washington was his own person. Washington was not a sycophantic follower of Hamilton or other intelligent people. He used those people to glean important information, as I said, but he wasn't a follower of anybody. Adams was in his presidency. Adams retained Washington's cabinet and became a sort of sycophantic follower of the high Federalists that were pushing him in this high Federalist direction. I think Adams lost control of his presidency. But we got about 2.5 minutes here. Miss Birthday Girl Vitek, do you have anything to say here? Thank you, David, for you brought up some intelligent points that I had not made in the previous 2 weeks to talk about, showing Jefferson is not such an angel as we sometimes might think.
Thank
Do
you
you
for
have anything
having
to say, Donna?
Oh,
Happy birthday.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. 54 years old. I really like this, our experiment today with adding a guest to the show that has something to bring in regarding the topic we're discussing. So I'd like to extend this to other people who are watching the show. If you have a topic that you would like for us to cover, please put it in the comments, and we would love to add a guest in the show to ask their question. And I appreciate you joining us, David, and sharing your expertise on what you studied to write your master's thesis. So this is wonderful.
Who's the gal from Friends? Jennifer, what's her name?
Jennifer Aniston.
Why can't we get her on?
Okay, so if anyone knows, anyone watching knows,
her to come on?
knows Jennifer Aniston, and if she would like to be on the show, please.
Yeah, I don't even care if she has anything politically interesting to say. Just have her on the show. That'd be kind of fun.
Okay.
Anyways, for a teaser for next week, we've talked about the sort of today. What we've done is we've understood that, in effect, Hamilton created Jefferson, the partisan Jefferson. I have my dog. Come on up, Jeff.
Oh, this is the real Jefferson, right? David.
We're going to look, was Jefferson really a political partisan person? So we're going to look at a 1789 letter to Francis Hopkinson, where Jefferson talks about the issue of partisanship. We'll answer the question. We've seen that Hamilton created this tension between himself and Jefferson that led to the two-party system, whether Jefferson liked it or not. But Jefferson believed in partisanship, So this letter to Francis Hopkinson, one of my favorites, by the way, and we'll answer that question. So we invite readers to come in to see, was